Hi, Sepp hier. Herzlich willkommen zu Vorpolitisch, dem Podcast rund um Gesellschaft, Philosophie und Sozialem. Hier bekommt ihr Shorts zu aktuellen Themen aus einem frischen Blickwinkel serviert. Hello and welcome to Vorpolitisch Meets, today with Holly Lawford-Smith. As you can hear, I'm recording this in English, which is what I'm not usually doing. I hope you can enjoy the conversation. And hello, Holly.
Hello, guten Tag.
That was perfect. Can we continue in German?
Probably with great difficulty. I've got about kindergarten level German.
Well, that's better than none. Do you want to introduce yourself with a few words and tell our listeners who you are?
I'm a philosopher. I guess that's my primary self-conception. I'm an associate professor at the University of Melbourne, where I teach political and moral philosophy. And I'm actually not even sure in what capacity I'm talking to you as a philosopher or as a feminist. I guess the other hat is a feminist and kind of involved in the public sphere recent debates over things like change to law around the recognition of legal sex and debates which I would frame as a conflict of interest between trans activism and feminism. So that's the hat that I might be like better known for than the philosophy hat, but the philosophy hat's the one that I'm more like strongly identified with at this time, I guess.
Yeah, so I had you down as a feminist philosopher, so I guess that mixes the both of them. You've written a couple of books recently. Do you want to tell us one or two things about those?
Yes, I'll just do a pedantic clarification though. In philosophy, feminist philosopher means the gang of super progressive feminists that subscribe to all the like current leftist orthodoxies and would certainly believe trans women are women. So I can't call myself a feminist philosopher, even though you are quite right that I'm both a philosopher and a feminist, but I'm an outcast from feminist philosophy. Look, your German audience probably won't care about that at all, but it's important to say for the, like if you have the odd American listening. I wrote a book that came out in 2022 called Gender Critical Feminism, and that was trying to give a philosophical account of the sort of emerging grassroots movement of gender critical feminism as I saw it, and to try to kind of give some shape to that. Maybe it's important to say I was kind of writing that from 2018 through 2019, and it took a while to come out, but I was doing that thinking in the early-ish days around the big storm of the UK debate over shifting to self-identification for legal sex. And so trying to sort of really articulate like what was driving this new movement, what was distinctive and interesting about it. And then 2023, I published a kind of what would follow up companion book called Sex Matters that was more focused on the direct conflict with trans activism. And last year, 2024, I shifted into focusing more on sex work, and so published a debate book called Is It Wrong to Buy Sex? With a co-author who was arguing that it's not wrong at all. And I, perhaps predictably, was arguing that it is absolutely wrong. And my next book, which will come out in May this year, is called Feminism Beyond Left and Right. And that's trying to argue that feminism is politically non-partisan, and my interlocutors are the feminists that think of themselves as essentially part of the left, and maybe position feminism as a kind of grand global justice project against all oppression. So I'm sort of trying to argue that that's a mistaken conception. And then I might stop writing books for a while. I don't know.
Yeah, probably not. But that's good. That's interesting because, over in Europe, we have very much similar debates. The self-ID that you mentioned, that German has this tendency to form long compound words. Ever heard of the Selbstbestimmungsgesetz?
No. Say it again.
Well, that's Selbstbestimmungsgesetz. So that's self-ID law. We've just had very similar debates. And So I'm curious to talk about what's specific to Australia, since,
Yeah.
we know what's going on over in Germany and we've had this debate and I had guests on the show that talked about Germany.
Yeah.
So can you give us a short history of like feminism in Australia? Is like, when did you guys get the vote? When were there like specific events happening? People one should know. Just a very like short summary.
Yeah, so just in terms of a brief timeline with some of the major milestones, women first got the right to vote in South Australia. That was in 1895. The first women were elected to the House of Representatives and the Senate in 1943. Women could first access the contraceptive pill if they were married in 1961. We got our first abortion rights in 1966. The first government funding for a women's refuge, as opposed to the refuges being run by feminists and based on like local fundraising, for example. First government funding was in 1975. Rape in marriage was outlawed in South Australia in 1976. The following year, 1977, the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act included gender and marital status as grounds of discrimination. We got our first maternity leave in 1979. In 1995, Victoria outlawed sexual harassment. Australia got its first female prime minister in 2010. That was Julia Gillard. And then relevant to the more current controversies that I think we'll be talking about more, both Tasmania and Victoria, two states of Australia, we got self-ID for legal sex in 2019. And in terms of feminists, Australian feminists that the world might have heard of, probably the most famous or notorious, depending on your viewpoint, would be Germaine Greer. She wrote The Female Eunuch in 1970. That was one of three books that came out in 1970 and I think really helped popularize and kick off the second wave feminist movement. The other two being Kate Millett's Sexual Politics and Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, so two Americans and one Australian. And again, the topic that we'll probably be talking about more, Germaine Greer became very controversial on the topic of trans issues for some comments that she made in various media appearances. But if your listeners want to get a sense of just how spicy her commentary was, there's an early article, short article in the Independent magazine from 22nd of July 1989. And its title is On Why Sex Change is a Lie. She's definitely not pulling any punches in that article about her views on the possibility of sex change or men becoming women.
As I mentioned, I'm interested in Australia-specific information, as my listeners are familiar with the German debate, and I've had guests on the show that have spoken about the German debate, both arguing for and against self-ID laws. What's the state of this discussion in Australia? What's the state of the law at the moment?
I would say the state of the discussion is bad. We didn't really have a debate, and I don't know how similar that is to what happened in Germany. Maybe it would be interesting to compare that, because here, very unlike the UK, the law was just kind of pushed through. Like the various state governments just kind of had the numbers to call this a progressive change that is good for trans people and bad for no one. And that's how it was positioned. So there was not a like large, controversial, heated public discussion. In Victoria, which is where I'm most familiar with and was one of the earlier ones, Tasmania was first, and then I think Victoria was second for self-ID per se. Yeah, it was just kind of pushed through as a like minor amendment when it comes to the registration of birth. And a few of us tried to get a public debate going. That was very unsuccessful. There was maybe, I don't know, 15 of us, and we're requesting meetings with politicians, and we managed to have one event. So we had a public event at the University of Melbourne, maybe got, I don't know, 100, 150 people in the audience. Got sort of counter petitioned by Equality Australia and roundly condemned as transphobes, and then the law passed. So the state of things in Australia is pretty bad. By now, many states have self-ID or something very close to it, extremely minimal gatekeeping on change of legal sex. And there have been a number of legal cases recently that really lock that in as our state of affairs. So the two that people might have heard of are, one is Lesbian Action Group, applied to get a Australian Human Rights Commission exemption. So it would not count as discrimination if they were to have events for lesbians only, which they had to articulate as lesbians born female, which is already fucking ridiculous. But that's the state of things in Australia, where you have to make it clear, because the courts will now say a man can be a lesbian if he identifies as one or identifies as a woman attracted to women. And the courts refused the Lesbian Action Group permission to do that on the grounds that they need to be inclusive of transgender women in particular. And the other case that people might have heard of is Tickle v. Giggle, where Sal Grover was the CEO or the owner of an app, social media app, and wanted to exclude a trans woman from that app. And the trans woman is currently winning in the sequence of the case that goes to appeal and so on. But he's currently winning. She does not have the right to exclude him because he has had his legal sex changed, and so counts as a woman for our purposes. So in terms of like hope for the gender critical position in Australia, there's virtually none, I would say. Like, it just looks like the trans inclusive position has become orthodoxy, and they've kind of won. They've won it in the various laws and states. Maybe there could be a big upset like there's been in America, like if a conservative government gets in at the next election, but it's hard to unwind laws, and it will take a big change here. Like, I think what some feminists are wanting is a amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act that makes it clear exactly how these different sex-related, potentially discriminatory things trade off against each other. So you can protect sexual orientation under the Sex Discrimination Act without conflating it with sex. You should be able to do the same with gender identity. But in practice, it's conflated absolutely everywhere. The idea is that if you have a gender identity, that kind of changes your sex for all practical purposes. Indeed, for all purposes, I would say. Are things that bad in Germany? Is it roughly the same?
Well, if you call that bad, yes.
Oh, sorry, great.
Yeah,
that
no,
great?
we actually had a very similar non-debate. Actually, there was a very famous press conference by our minister for what is she? Minister for Women, Youth, and the Elderly, or something rather.
Yeah.
And she was asked the question, and she said, "It's like, oh, I don't see any reason for a debate here." So they even made it very, very explicit.
Wow.
We just got a self-ID law. I think it was last year or the year before. So if you want to take a note, that's Lisa Paus, Paus. You can look that up. We just got a self-ID law in Germany last year or the year before. I don't remember.
And that's the whole country. It's not state.
No, that's federal law.
Wow. Okay.
We need federal law, and also, as you said, it changes. Well, like it treats gender identity basically as sex for all purposes.
Yeah.
And that was something that I was found interesting that you were referring to. Is it Tickle or Giggle? Which one? As him, like in Germany, that would be illegal now.
Yes. Oh, I saw that in the news about the podcasters, right? The German podcasters that used he in an episode for a trans woman, and then what did they get threatened with? A huge fine, or absolutely insane?
10,000 euro fine that misgendering.
I mean, I've read some of the legal kind of background stuff around this, like the sense that it's really this incredible violation of a trans person's dignity, because they they feel so strongly about this, and then it can be nothing other than an insult if you're going to use the wrong pronouns. And I feel like that sort of reasoning, there's a case from Canberra in Australia where the judge is very explicit about that kind of reasoning. He invokes this idea of like everything that they've gone through. And it seems to really depend on this old model of the transsexual, like where they really have this revelation and then they go to all this like plastic surgery and surgical transition, like taking hormones, doing this whole process to kind of quote unquote pass as the opposite sex. The judge seemed to be like really receptive to what it would be like to have done all that work and then still be like disrespected. That's in quote marks. I know it's audio only, but like disrespected by what it's like to have done all that and still not be like treated as the thing by the person on the street. My worry about that is that it really doesn't fit the contemporary cohort of trans people, because you might have some of that kind of really old school transsexual that goes through all those steps, but medical surgical transition is increasingly rare, like less than 10%, and maybe even lower than that by now, because that's a slightly old figure. And you can get people who don't transition in any meaningful way. It's just a kind of identity declaration. So yeah, it's interesting that the reasoning behind the idea that it's such an assault on a trans person's dignity or humanity or standing or whatever to be misgendered, I feel like it's really dependent on this much older model of what it means to be trans. And maybe if the courts eventually catch up to what it actually means today, like you can just declare yourself non-binary overnight, maybe that idea will shift a bit. I'm not sure.
Probably will take time. But so your stance is that trans women are
Men.
men. What's your
Yep.
like reasoning? Take us through your reasoning. Make the argument. Just make the case.
It's so funny to have to make the case because I'm sort of at a point where it's so obvious, and then it's almost like, what could the other case be? But okay, make the case. Ordinary language usage, a man is an adult human male. That's an extremely widely shared way that we use our language. Of course, you can be an activist about the language and think that there should be a shift from the terms man and woman picking out sex to instead picking out something like gender identity. The problem is they don't tend to make the argument, and the concept of gender identity tends to be entirely incoherent whenever anyone tries to fill it in. So it looks like a sort of activist language usage where you say trans women are women and trans men are men. You're trying to change the meaning of woman and man so that it is inclusive in this way of this particular minority group that you are interested in. And if the only thing that matters in the whole world is being kind to a marginalized group, then maybe that's a sufficient argument. If anything else matters, then it probably isn't. And one of the things that the gender critical feminists are trying to get across to ordinary people that just wonder what all the fuss is about in this debate is that, like, feminists have had an interest in the word woman as a part of feminism since at least the start of the second wave, but actually much longer. That it's really hard to do the work of feminism and articulating the political interests of that group if you don't have a word to refer to it with. And the thing that is most politically salient to women's situation is their treatment on the basis of sex and all the kind of social ideas and stereotypes and norms that build up around that. So these are crucial to the work of doing feminism, and therefore we have a reason to resist this linguistic activism that tries to change the meaning of the word in the interest of trans inclusion and turn women into a kind of hodgepodge mixed sex group with no political interests in common. So that's the case for trans women are not women, trans women are men. It's a feminist normative case for that conclusion. Someone could come back and say, well, still, shouldn't you just call them that because it'll make them happy? Well, maybe interpersonally, yeah, you could do that if it had no consequences, but certainly not as a person out there in the public sphere trying to make the case for these concepts being important to feminism, then it's really important that you speak in the way that your ideology or your political purposes require. So for me, I'm, whenever I can, trans women are men and he, him, even though people find that really callous or cruel or disrespectful or whatever else.
And you just used the term second wave. Can you maybe just have a quick explanation for people not that familiar with like what was the first wave, second wave, where are we now?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the problem of being deep in the weeds of some discussion, isn't it? And I always do this with students as well. Um, so second wave feminism kicked off in the mid to late 1960s in the US, and then a little later in other places. First wave tends to refer to the vote, be sort of very focused around that single issue of suffrage. And popular narratives will tell you there was a kind of dead zone in between because people were exhausted, although there was actually, depends who you read, but a lot of like various bits of activity going on in between. But it's true that the second wave from the mid to late 60s on really caused a big resurgence in interest and a big kind of diversification of topics. So where the first wave is more about the vote, the second wave then is more about like figuring out which of the issues in women's lives that they experience allegedly personally are actually of political interest and they have in common. So there's a focus on things like abortion rights, domestic violence rights in shelters, workplace protections, just a much bigger kind of set of issues that are of interest to the women at the time. And maybe there's a real blossoming of feminist theory. So they become interested in trying to diagnose what is it that women have in common? What is women's political situation? And how do we get out of it? Like, what are the strategies for smashing the patriarchy that mean like we can get to a future that has women's liberation or women's equality? So that is really where you start seeing the language of women's liberation appear. And I don't know anything about when exactly this kind of caught on in Germany. I sort of know the American and then a bit the Australian and New Zealand and British.
I'm not a specialist, but I guess very similar time.
Mm.
Alice Schwarzer would maybe a name that you might have heard. She was like an iconic figure in the
Mm-hmm.
German women's liberation movement. But yeah, I'm no specialist on that.
Mm. I should talk to someone. Many things to put on the agenda for the future because it's like it happened at a different time in like Spain and in France, and yeah, I'm just less across the details of exactly those movements.
Yeah. So where are we now? Third wave, fourth wave? What's going on?
Oh, that's actually controversial because some people use third. I mean, we are at least in or past third wave. That can be definitely said. So second wave, the maybe you could say there were warring factions: the liberal feminists and the radical feminists, the reformers and the revolutionaries. It's one way to think of it. And the reformers kind of won, and then the third wave became very fixated on inclusion and very fixated on intersectionality. And where we are now is some sort of consequence of that, where you see the kind of sense that feminism is a project for all oppressed peoples in all respects. I think that came out of focusing so much on inclusion and the people who are at the margins or left out, and then focusing on people in all the respects of their identity. So it's not just about being a woman, it's about being like a disabled Black lesbian woman and what that the phenomenology of that is like and what sort of unique oppression she faces. So again, different people will argue about, well, maybe like neoliberalism is really important in the description of where the current feminist movement is at. There's lots of stuff to talk about there. But yeah, we're either in the third wave or there was a little not that popular effort to say we're in the fourth wave, and the fourth wave is social media feminism. But that's not really an ideological difference. It's a technology facilitating ideas difference. And I'm not sure if that changes things sufficiently to call it a new wave. And I think some people, there's like fourth wave now or whatever. So some people then use fourth wave, I think, as a name for getting backlash on the gender nonsense. So that all just becomes very confusing. So I think if I had to tell it to students, I would just say the third wave won against the second wave, and we stopped being focused on women as a class and sex as a really important feature. We started caring about absolutely everyone and everything under the name of feminism, but we really mean global justice. And then I just throw my hands up and have no further opinions about whether we are in another another wave, a later wave, or whatever.
Okay, that's very interesting. My view is always that social media doesn't change the ideology; it just makes it dumber, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. I think that's probably right. I mean, it can, I guess the one thing that makes it distinctive for feminism is the organizing capacity. So it's something like, or maybe also if we were still doing consciousness raising, where it's like we need to talk to a great number of women and find out what we have in common. Maybe social media makes that conversation global, so you can find out stuff that you just never would have had access to before. And then for organizing, it's like, well, you can plot your revolution on a much larger scale now and get the word out easily. But again, these are just, they're differences in scale, not differences in like your analysis of the problem or your approach to solving the problem. So I think I would be inclined to agree.
Gefällt euch vorpolitisch? Gefällt euch vorpolitisch genug, um den Podcast aktiv zu unterstützen? Wenn ja, dann könnt ihr mir über die Coffee-App einen virtuellen Kaffee ausgeben. Einfach auf ko-fi.com/vorpolitisch gehen und spenden. Das ist ko-fi.com/vorpolitisch. Für jede Unterstützung jetzt schon. Vielen herzlichen Dank.
You've said the word gender nonsense a couple of times. I think,
Have I?
We've talked about sex. I think everybody knows what that is. But yeah, you said before, when people try to define gender identity, it's hard to even like get a coherent definition of that. It's like, do you have a like at least hand-wavy definition of gender identity? Are those two things different? How do you think about that?
I actually think this distinction would do so much to help the current debate if it were made more clearly. So I think that's a great question. I think the gender critical feminists and the second wave feminists, if we were doing it in a time period way, we make a very clear distinction between gender and gender identity. So gender is a psychological state. It's subjective. It's how you feel about yourself. And it has something to do with masculinity or femininity, and maybe to do with the words woman and man, which some people use to refer to those states. So if you are a female person, you look deep inside and find some like masculinity and what you code as mannish type stuff, you might decide that you really are a man. That's your gender identity. That's a very imprecise gloss, but it's something like what gets talked about over in transactivism. But the concept that was crucial to the political purposes of the second wave is gender as opposed to sex, meaning the social stuff imposed on the natural category of biological sex. So you can think of the female as like the clay, and the gendering of the female into the feminine as like the making of the statue by the sculptor or whatever. It's like the raw materials are sex, and then the submissive, contained bodily movements, insecure, pretty, whatever features of the feminine, or of the woman, if you want to use that word in that way, that is gender. And that makes sense of why some of the second wavers described themselves as gender abolitionists or gender eliminationists. They wanted to take the social pressure on the female to become feminine and get rid of that. And that leaves open a lot of debate still. You could still try to have it out, like between the biologists and the neuroscientists and the whoever looks into the human behavior and figure out whether there really are any differences between the sexes that will strongly predispose them toward certain sorts of differences in behavior, maybe it'll turn out that like there's just some innate module in the brain that makes you want to dress pretty when you're female and not when you're male. Like that, okay, open scientific question whether that's possible. But if that turned out to be true, it would just mean that some of the things that the second wavers thought were gender were on the social side rather than the natural side, actually turned out to be on the natural side all along. So in a way, you've got like your whole category of stuff you think of as femininity, and then this open question about whether all of it is nonsense, sort of socialized and socially imposed, or maybe whether like some or most of it is nonsense, but actually some of it is like inherited as a result of our evolutionary history or whatever. So that, again, sorry, I know that was a really long way to answer that, but that's to say there is a really important and crucial gender/gender identity distinction. And the problem today is that a lot of people just say gender and they mean gender identity. And they don't realize that in doing that, they are kind of obliterating this extremely important political concept for feminists, and that is like necessary for women's liberation. And again, that is like the motivation for why gender critical feminists push back so hard on trans activism, because they're like, wait, that's not what gender is. And we actually need that idea. Like we really need that idea. And we're at risk of then, like, by turning it into this innate thing, the logical consequence of that, if gender is only gender identity, is that all the feminine women are just the like natural normal ones. And there's just a few like masculine atypical females who might as well be trans. So all the feminists are trans now. Like anyone who's like atypical is just trans. And that's like such a stupid diagnosis in political terms of what's going on with like so-called gender nonconformity. And I feel like this should be conducive to a German audience, by the way, because I spent a year living in Germany and the women were not high femme gender conforming. Like it seemed to me that German women like understand instinctively that a woman can be anything, and there's no way that a woman has to like appear or behave or she's not naturally feminine. Like of all the countries that have strong and weak gender nonsense, Germany seemed to me like a country that had weak gender nonsense. And so it's also inexplicable why there's so much uptake to trans activism there. I find that really puzzling.
Well, here's a challenge for you, making gender nonsense into a technical term now.
Okay. In that last rant, I guess that I meant something like believing in the complementarity of the sexes, such that masculinity and femininity are natural packages of traits that most or all people of the sex will end up displaying or having. And so rather than believing in a world where if you didn't pressure everyone, there'd just be a whole spectrum of personality traits and they wouldn't really vary by sex, you believe that there are the pretty homemakers and the tough worldly work people or whatever, however you want to carve that up. Exactly. Do you think there's the two types of persons, or do you think there's just humans and all their multifaceted mosaic of personality traits and preferences and behaviors and hobbies and jobs and so on? And I'm team human, not team two types of humans that are nearly different species.
And see, that's the thing that puzzles me so much. I mean, you know that I'm a philosopher by training as well, who doesn't practice philosophy anymore. But anyway, but to me, the second wave makes sense, right? We try to raise little girls and say, you can be anything. You want to be a firefighter? Be a firefighter. You know, who cares? Like firefighting is not for men, as people thought in an earlier period. And, you know, so to me, it's absolutely puzzling that now people say it's like, oh, but, you know, there is femininity and that's what makes you a woman. It's like, didn't we try to get away from that? Shouldn't little girls be able to do whatever they want, and little boys, if they want to play with dolls, then play with dolls? And
exactly.
and basically, so one of the arguments that I often see online is that you want to police who's female enough, which to me is already weird. That enough is already weird. But
Yeah.
what do you answer to that challenge?
It seems like they are just conflating sex with gender and gender adjacent concepts there. Because as you say, there's no female enough, there's just female and male. And usually people who will say sentences like that, they're not actually talking about sex at all, right? They're talking about something like behavior or appearance or presentation. So you can have a hulking great 6'4" man in dungarees or whatever, and he's a woman if he feels like a woman, and you're policing womanhood if you say that it's clear that that's a man. It's not policing to have natural categories and for those categories to have boundaries. Like, it's not exclusion for there to be objects and entities in the world. Like, this is just this is just a philosopher rant, but it's like, there are mountains, that's fine. It's not exclusionary of the lakes to be like, no, these are the properties you have to count as a mountain. It's just a descriptive project. Sex is on the descriptive project side, and there is just all this mess after that and on top of that, conflating all these different concepts. I don't know why trans activists can't just be like, yeah, there is sex. Sometimes that's the thing that matters. Oh, yeah, there is gender. Sometimes that's the thing that matters. Oh, and there's this way I feel about myself. Most people don't care about that, but I care a lot. And let's just try to figure out when that thing should matter and when the other things should matter. If they were just reasonable in that way, there would be no problem. But again, from their point of view, they haven't been reasonable and they've won huge successes in Germany and Australia. So maybe they're politically savvy. It worked in some places and it really didn't work in others like the US and the UK.
Which is very interesting because, like, in German, I think one of the big issues we have is that you make the distinction between sex and gender, and for most people that's not very clear, and it might be rough around the edges, but at least you have two words. In German we sometimes use gender as in the English word, but we have one word that says Geschlecht. That's a mixed property. So
for both.
When,
and so would biologists use the word Geschlecht, like in a biology class? Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if you talk about, a cat being male or female, that would be its Geschlecht.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about, butlerian stuff, that's also Geschlecht. And it's like, even language-wise, a big mess.
Do you have the distinction between female and woman, at least, where you might use female for a cat that has the sex, but not for a human? Would you call a cat Frau or whatever?
No, we wouldn't call her. So Frau is the human. That's
okay,
clear,
good.
right?
Okay.
But we have what's female, weiblich.
Yeah.
But that would also refer to her being female, as in the bodily characteristics, as well as the gendered stuff. So it's weiblich to, I don't know, wear a dress or something. The femininity. We don't just make a distinction between female and femininity. We again have one word that conflates both.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Because then I can see how the mess in the language conduces to the ideological mess. If people aren't used to making those distinctions anyway, or they don't, if probed, kind of know that it's a polysemous term, like, yeah, in this biology context, it means sex, but in this gender studies context, it means the social stuff. Like, if they just don't really know that and it's already all mixed together, I can see how it's harder to insist on the differences that matter.
Why do you think it caught on in Australia, but not in, the UK, as they call it, Turf Island? Because, I mean, you speak the same language, you're very culturally close. Any ideas?
Yes. I think that the huge thing is whether or not there was a public debate or not. If the legislators said, hey, we're about to make this consequential change to the entire way of thinking about what sex and or gender are, what do you guys think? Australians would have been like, absolutely not. Like, Australians are sensible, down to earth, like no bullshit people. You talk to any Uber driver ever, they never know that this ridiculous law is in place. They'll be shocked to hear that lesbian could be a man and he could have to come to the events. Like, the whole thing is just insane. The difference is only that the UK made it a consultation, and then the feminists managed to get enough grassroots stuff going that it kicked off the debate. They got their reasons into the public sphere with much difficulty, by the way, like a lot of really hard and painful work, a lot of resistance, a lot of personal cost. But that debate gave them the foot in the door to make it a public conversation and get all the like awful details out on the table. Just never happened in Australia. So most people here just don't know that that's the law. And you have this tiny handful of militant, loud leftists that got what they want and then kind of push that through the institutions. I'd be surprised even if, like, I'm in the most left-wing state at probably the most or one of the most left-wing campuses in Australia. There are trans pride flags absolutely everywhere at the moment, and sometimes they just stay up for 3 months for no reason. I'm sure that even if you surveyed the entire university community here, probably most people would not be on board with all of the ideological claims of trans activism, or even most of them. But they're not given a choice. And there's not really a discussion about it. It's just put in the press, if it ever is, in these like positive puff stories about trans human rights. And it's always presented that there's no conflict and nothing to talk about, just some tiny changes that are good for this beleaguered minority group. So I really do, I feel strongly about that the only difference is whether there was a debate or not.
It's interesting. So you might know that in Germany we had, the hint of a discussion developing. A group got an article into one of Germany's daily newspapers, and they picked the weakest of the bunch. Like, it was a bunch of people that signed the open letter. I can't remember, I think 5 or 6. One of them was a director of a gender clinic, a well-known psychologist, and they picked the weakest of the bunch, who was just, a doctoral PhD student in biology. You might have heard of her, Marie-Louise Vollbrecht.
Yes.
Yeah, like she got pummeled. She got put on public TV, like one of the biggest German like late night TV shows made fun of her as, transphobe, and people are always phobes of something, and
right.
I think that discouraged the discussion in Germany, in my opinion. It was very successful, like, stick your head up and you get, have your head cut off.
Yes, right. You're thinking the fear of that early intervention suppressed any discussion that might have otherwise been able to get going. That's very interesting too, because it would make me want to look at the earliest moments in the UK and what exactly, because that must have happened too, right? That people I know Julie Bindel spoke out in like 2011 or some crazy early time and somehow managed to stay a feminist public figure that whole time. And then maybe it's something about like, well, the original stuff kicked off on Mumsnet and you have enough anonymity that you can't get the personal backlash that shuts you up. Like, I'm just speculating, but I wonder what it was that meant that it could be kind of so effectively nipped in the bud in Germany and almost just entirely avoided in Australia. But something about how it happened in the UK meant that it could catch on like wildfire. And then you could get to the point where like you do a large public opinion survey and you find out that like the only reason people agree about bathroom use or whatever is that they think trans means transsexual and they've all had surgery. And when they find out they haven't, the results completely shift. It's like that for those things to be revealed, you need to have had a big kind of informative public debate.
Yeah, Jane Clare Jones in the UK. I don't know if you know her. She's been on this stuff like since 2012, and it's still making her case and still getting misunderstood. And I think if I was on a topic for 13 years and people would still get it wrong, I'd go mad.
No, it's true. Yeah, you have to have a certain sort of like doggedness and patience and it's like a unique set of traits to be able to just do this relentlessly. And the groups like, why am I now blanking on their name? The group that did the events in particular, God, the trade unionist women, because they would like put on a public event and then have like trans activists show up and like beat their fists on the walls. And it's like the persistence required to just keep organizing events and try to persuade people to show up and walk the gamut, like walk through those horrible crowds of people screaming at you and insulting you, until such a time as the activists just get tired and give up. Like, again, it's really admirable in the sense of like, you just have to wait out the bad bit, and the bad bit might go for 2 years before you can then have events and platform great speakers and just be a normal part of the public discussion. Yeah, those groups, maybe that is the difference maker, that there just were these groups that had this previous organizational experience and were persistent. And I don't know, because we certainly didn't have that in Australia.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that, you see these masked people screaming at elderly ladies who just want to have a discussion.
Yeah.
But somehow they're the good guys.
Yeah. No, I know. The optics wise, it just shouldn't be that way. But somehow there's such an ingrained sense of who are the oppressed that you can have those optics and people can still think like, the brave face covered anarchist, like he's the freedom fighter and she's the bully. Yeah, it's really bizarre. But I guess, people just, it really is in the public consciousness that like trans people are oppressed and any person standing up for them is on the side of good rather than evil.
Okay, and looking at the time, as I don't want to go on for too long, so what are the 2 or 3 main areas of conflict where you say this is where sex matters and that's why we have to have this discussion? What are like the 3 main points where you say is women as a class need to exist, especially in law still?
Oh, there's such a long list of conflict areas, but maybe the most serious ones, I guess, are prisons. So the implications of shifting just to self-ID in law, sending male criminals into women's prisons when women are already so vulnerable. I think that's a very serious policy area. The hospital ward stuff is really concerning me lately, like the figures out of the UK revealing the extraordinarily high rate of sexual assaults in hospitals. And I think there might have been more information since I read the report. Joe Phoenix shared some stuff late last year, I think. It wasn't totally clear what was causing this, like whether it was low security in hospitals such that people were coming in off the street, whether it was doctors or nurses, whether it was other patients. But it looks like there was already this very serious problem. And then the threat to single-sex hospital wards as a way of keeping people safe looks like a big policy problem here. Go ahead.
So, sorry, I have not heard about this at all. Can you give a little bit more background? I'm really,
right.
like, it's the first time I'm hearing about this.
Well, hospital wards have already always been one of the single-sex spaces that have been on the list of concerns when it comes to the gender-critical position, because people feel very strongly for privacy reasons and trust reasons, if they have like a background of sexual assault or whatever, that they want to be in a female-only ward or receiving female-only aftercare. So it's kind of already like anything that is a female-only space or service or provision is on our list. But yeah, last year and I think the year before, there was some empirical work done in the UK showing that there was a very serious social problem of sexual assaults perpetrated in hospitals. And I guess that's because the patients are very vulnerable, like knocked out on drugs or recovering or whatever. But yeah, as I said, at the report that I read, it wasn't totally clear what the perpetrator pool problem was. So the thought is just that this really exacerbates or makes more important the issue of single-sex hospital wards for women's safety and security. It puts it up closer to something like the prisons issue than something comparatively more trivial, even if important, like the bathrooms issue or whatever. And I think maybe I often think like the issue that gets so much attention in this discussion is sport. And it's a good public hook for the gender critical position, because it's like so easy to make the case in biological terms that there's a sort of strength and size difference, or that the male punching power is so much greater than the female punching power, things like that. But so like as a strategy, it's a really good case. Aussies really care about sport, so it's a great thing for us to try to like put in the media to get attention for why this issue matters. But it's interesting in the sense like whether or not it's really a front and center feminist issue, because it does depend so much on mere biological differences. Like it's not something that's really important to women as a class or women as a political movement with political interests, unless you really leaned into like the camaraderie and solidarity benefits of team sport for women's confidence and solidarity. Then it would be more of a politicized issue. So I think then I'd be inclined to like push towards something more like women only, I don't know, drug and alcohol recovery groups or sexual assault recovery groups, where it really matters that there's a shared experience among women and that it feels like a safe space for women to talk about what happened to them. And it kind of depends on an antagonism between women and men, like men perpetrate this kind of violence against women and women are together trying to recover from that experience. There's a real threat to the psychological benefit of those spaces if they just become male inclusive at the whim of any male. Like that can be so disruptive to a group like that. And that is more political than something like the sports case, even though the sports case is easier to make. So those are maybe three where I'm kind of inclined to go toward them if there's some sort of opportunity to discuss them publicly.
Okay, thanks. That's actually a great point that I haven't heard before. The mere biological versus more politicized. That's a great point to make. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think we could make an end here. Do you have anything else that's really dear to your heart that you would like to add to talk about?
No, lots of things are dear to my heart, but it was nice to talk with you.
So your book is coming out in May. What was the title again?
It's called Feminism Beyond Left and Right, and it's coming out with Polity, and I think it's maybe $20-ish, $20 or $30-ish. Finally, I published an affordable book, which I'm looking forward to. Because academic books, as you know, tend to be drastically overpriced and buyable by no one. But I've now fallen out with my academic publisher and I'm moving on.
Perfect. So I urge anybody who is listening to this to get the book. And thank you very much for your time, Holly.
Thank you.
Hier endet eine weitere Episode von Vorpolitisch, dem Podcast rund um Gesellschaft, Philosophie und Soziale. Vielen Dank für eure Zeit. Und wenn es euch gefallen hat, hört beim nächsten Mal wieder zu und vor allem teilt den Link zu diesem Kanal auf Facebook, Twitter und wo ihr sonst noch unterwegs seid. Warum nicht jetzt sofort? Ich bin Sepp, macht's gut und bis zum nächsten Mal.